Hello, welcome to Choir Repertoire. Johann Sebastian Bach is regarded by many as the greatest composer of all time, but this view took some time to form, stemming only from the 19th century. He is certainly the leading composer of the Baroque period, although his music was not always equally appreciated in his own lifetime. By contrast to his outstanding performing abilities. Mattheson, for example, described him in 1717 as the famous Weimar organist. He may not need much introduction to most of you, therefore we'll keep it short. Bach was born in 1685 in the town of Eisenach in Thuringia, where Luther had also lived more than a century earlier. This coincidence was not without significance. Martin Luther, who lived from 1483 to 1546, was a church reformer, but also the composer of many church chorale texts and melodies, including the melody and text of the work under discussion, Ein feste Burg. Those melodies were used and elaborated by many well-known composers, including by Bach. Johann Sebastian was the youngest child of a very musical family, with his father being a civic musician and all of his uncles who were professional musicians too, and already including a number of composers in all the generations of the family. He appears to have learned the violin and keyboard instruments via his own family members. Now, we are not going to narrate here the entire life and career of Bach. You will find much more complete biographies on the internet. I will only highlight some of his main posts throughout the years. At a young age already, he was appointed organist in different cities, first in Arnstadt and after that in Mühlhausen. But in 1708 he moved to become organist in Weimar, in service with Duke Wilhelm Ernst. Here 6 of his children were born, including Karl Philipp Emanuel, who was to become a well-known composer in his own lifetime. He was now responsible for writing a new cantata every 4 weeks. Although he certainly did not strictly adhere to this rule. Some years later, in 1717, Bach moved to Cöthen to work as Kapellmeister for Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Cöthen, a young music lover and connoisseur. He mainly wrote secular music here. In 1723, he took up the varied and very demanding position of cantor at the Thomaskirche in conjunction with civic director of music of the city of Leipzig, a prestigious position in that area in Germany. As the most important musician in the town, he was primarily responsible for all of the musical activity in the 4 principal churches in Leipzig, including St. Thomas's, as well as responsible for the town's musical life in general. Not surprisingly, given that he stayed here until his death 27 years later, the vast bulk of his cantatas date from his Leipzig years. This totaled about 300 sacred cantatas. Some are lost. In Protestant Germany, the cantata was an integral part of the Lutheran liturgy. Bach's wide range of duties also included being musical director to the university, as well as being responsible for the musical training of the pupils at the Thomasschule, who could be called on to contribute as singers and also instrumentalists to his performances. Next to the aforementioned cantatas, his period in Leipzig witnessed the production of the Magnificat, the Passions, the harpsichord partitas, amongst many other compositions. Bach died in Leipzig in 1750, after some serious health issues. Today we are looking at a Bach chorale. But what is a chorale? Grove Music Online defines it as follows: the congregational hymn of the German Protestant Church service. Typically, it possesses certain formal and stylistic traits appropriate to its lay purposes. Simple language, rhymed metrical verse, a strophic musical and textual form, and an easily singable melody. As said earlier, Luther himself wrote many chorale melodies and texts. He wanted the congregation to fully appreciate the Bible text, so it was only logical to write them in the language of the people, German, and not in Latin, the language of the Western Church at that moment. By having them sung, Luther wanted the chorale, and thus its message, to be remembered more easily. He also favored the evolution towards four-part harmonized settings of hymns or chorale melodies in order to support congregational singing, such as by accompaniment of an organ, for example. This tradition still existed in Bach's time, and he perfected this art with original, expressive and sometimes surprisingly explorative harmonizations, often producing very different and multiple versions of settings of the same melody. You're probably familiar with the famous Passion Chorale, O Sacred Head, Now Wounded, or in German, O Haupt voll Blut. Bach uses 5 stanzas of this hymn in 4 different settings in his St. Matthew's Passion. So Bach's 4-part settings are never limited to a simple chordal scheme, but are frequently exquisite gems of harmony and part writing very worth closer scrutiny. Apart from being used in liturgy, Bach furnished his cantatas with 1 or sometimes 2 appropriate chorales. These chorales were also at times a source of inspiration or compositional catalyst for other parts of the cantatas, generating more complex music such as chorale fantasies based on these. These chorales were brimming with significance for the congregation, being very well known personally to them, which underpinned the narrative of the cantatas and provided an important moment of peace and harmony, as well as the opportunity for meditation or contemplation. That the chorales were central to the cantatas is not just reflected in the fact that they nearly always formed the closing item, but were also used to entitle them. Each cantata was usually entitled after their chorale. Now, the chorale Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, which translates into A mighty fortress is our God, is an example of such a melody and text written by Luther himself around 1529, probably in collaboration with the composer Johann Walter. The text was imported to Lutheran theology and has been set to music by many composers. It is not exactly certain when Bach wrote this particular setting and for which occasion either, but it is assumed that he had used it earlier in Weimar for the now lost cantate BWV303, entitled Alles was von Gott geboren, written in 1715 or 16. This same music probably served as the source for the later cantata BWV80, having the same title as this chorale, Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott. Now, this chorale under discussion received the number BWV303 and survived only as a manuscript without its accompanying text. The text was then later reconstructed. Because of this, there are a few scores with slight variations in text settings. However, most scores feature only one of Luther's strophes, although he originally wrote 4 for this chorale. In this video, I will concentrate on this first strophe. In our analysis video, I will also explain about the other 3. Now, this is the text of the first strophe, together with the translation to English.
Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, ein guter Will und Waffen. Hilft uns rein aus aller Not, die uns jetzt hat betroffen.
Now, this translation was written by Frederick Hedge in 1852. Typical of its time, it is not a literal English translation, but recreated to form workable rhyming verse designed for singing and which caters to 19th century taste. You can, of course, choose to sing this English text, but we encourage you to try and sing the original German words. If needed, feel free to click on the link for an audio illustration of the pronunciation of the original German text. We also provide a guide to general German pronunciation rules on this website. The text expresses the believer's confidence in God. While the world we live in may be fraught with dangers and mighty enemies, we need not fear. God is like a mighty and invincible fortress that will protect us and live on forever. Of course, there's nothing to stop you singing all 4 of the strophes if you wish in your own performance. In our recording, we chose to sing 3 of these strophes, 1, 2 and 4. The setting of Bach contains some interesting chord progressions and modulations, and they are enlivened with some colorful, suggestive chromatic inflections like the sudden decorative C natural in the first bar in the tenors. There are many harmonically daring passing notes, some falling on weaker passing beats. I will point out some of this sparkling harmonization in the analysis video. This is Bach in his element. In our video on performance of this chorale, we also discuss the fermata or pause marks that you find throughout the score. What to do with those? There are also other considerations to take into account, like the pronunciation of the text and how to keep your performance transparent and musically interesting. I hope I have sparked your interest in the little musical gems that are the chorales of Johann Sebastian Bach. Make sure to watch our other videos on this subject. I'm sure they will help you to excel in your own performance.